The Blind Side by Michael Lewis, a New York Times bestseller. By the author of Moneyball. Chapter 1. Backstory. From the snap of the ball to the snap of the first bone is closer to 4 seconds than to 5. One Mississippi, the quarterback of the Washington football team, Joe Theismann, turns and hands the ball to running back John Riggins. He watches Riggins run 2 steps forward, turn, and flip the ball back to him. It's what most people know as a flea flicker, but the Redskins call it a throwback special. 2 Mississippi. Theismann searches for a receiver, but instead sees Harry Carson coming straight at him. It's a running down. The start of the second quarter, 1st and 10 at midfield. With the score tied 7-7, the New York Giants linebacker has been so completely suckered by the fake that he's deep in the Redskins' backfield. Carson thinks he's come to tackle Riggins, but Riggins is long gone. So Carson just keeps running toward Theismann. 3 Mississippi. Carson now sees that Theismann has the ball. Theismann notices Carson coming straight at him, and so he has time to avoid him. He steps up and to the side, and Carson flies right on by and out of the play. The play is now 3.5 seconds old. Until this moment, it had been defined by what the quarterback can see. Now it and he is at the mercy of what he cannot see. You don't think of fear as a factor in professional football. You assume that the sort of people who make it to the NFL are immune to the emotion. Perhaps they don't mind being hit, or maybe they just don't get scared. But the idea of pro football players sweating and shaking and staring at the ceiling at night worrying about the next day's violence seems preposterous. The head coach of the Giants, Bill Parcells, didn't think it preposterous, however. Parcells, whose passion is the football defense, believed that fear played a big role in the game. So did his players. They'd witnessed up close the response of opposing players to their own Lawrence Taylor. The tackle who had just quit the Philadelphia Eagles, for instance, Jerry Sizemore, had played tackle in the NFL for 8 years when, in 1981, Taylor arrived. Sizemore played on the right side of the offensive line, and Taylor usually came off the other end. But Sizemore still had to worry about the few times Taylor lined up across from him. Their teams were in the same NFL division and met twice each regular season. The week leading up to those games, Sizemore confessed, unnerved him. Quote, "Toward the middle of the week, something would come over you and you'd just start sweating," he told the New York Times. My last year in the league, opening day, he immediately got past me. He just looked at me and laughed. Right there, I thought I had to get out of this game. And after that season, 1984, he did. The feeling of those assigned to prevent Taylor from hurting quarterbacks were trivial compared to those of the quarterbacks he wanted to hurt. In Taylor's first season in the NFL, no official records were kept of quarterback sacks. In 1982, after Taylor had transformed the quarterback sack into the turning point of a football game, a new official NFL statistic was born. The record books defined the sack as tackling the quarterback behind the line of scrimmage as he attempts to pass. Taylor offered his own definition. Quote, "A sack is when you run up behind somebody who's not watching. He doesn't see you, and you really put your helmet into him. The ball goes fluttering everywhere, and the coach comes out and asks the quarterback, 'Are you all right?' That's a sack." End quote. After his first NFL season, Taylor became the only rookie ever named the league's most valuable defensive player, and he published a treatise on his art. Quote, "I don't like to just wrap the quarterback," he explained. Quote, "I really try to make him see 7 fingers when they hold up 3. I'll drive my helmet into him, or if I can, I'll bring my arm up over my head and try to axe the son of a bitch in 2. So long as the guy holding the ball, I intend to hurt him. If I hit the guy right, I'll hit a nerve and he'll feel electrocuted. He'll forget for a few seconds that he's on a football field." End quote. The game of football evolved, and here was one cause of its evolution: a new kind of athlete doing a new kind of thing. All by himself, Lawrence Taylor altered the environment and forced opposing coaches and players to adapt. After Taylor joined the team, the Giants went from the second worst defense in the NFL to the third best. The year before his debut, they gave up 425 points. His first year, they gave up 257 points. They had been one of the weakest teams in the NFL and were now, overnight, a contender. Of course, Taylor wasn't the only change in the New York Giants between 1980 and 1981. There was one other important newcomer, Bill Parcells, hired first to coach the Giants' defense and then the entire team. Parcells became a connoisseur of the central nervous system of opposing quarterbacks. The symptoms induced by this sack-happy linebacker included, but were not restricted to, quote, intimidation, lack of confidence, quick throws, nervous feet, concentration lapses, and wanting to know where Lawrence is all the time. The players on the Giants' defense picked up the same signals. As defensive back, Beasley Reese told the New York Times, "I've seen quarterbacks look at Lawrence and forget the snap count." One opposing quarterback, finding himself under the center before the snap and unable to locate Taylor, called a timeout rather than running the play, only to find Taylor standing on the sidelines. Quote, "I think I saw it more with the quarterbacks in our division," says Giants linebacker Harry Carson. "They knew enough to be afraid, but every quarterback has a certain amount of fear when he played us." By his fourth pro season, Taylor was not just feeding these fears, but feeding off them. "They come to the line of scrimmage, and the first thing they do is start looking for me," he said. "I know, and they know. When they'd find me, they'd start screaming, 56 left, 56 left." Taylor wore number 56. "So there's this thing I did. After the play was over, I'd come up behind them and whisper, 'Don't worry where I am. I'll tell you when I get there.'" A new force in pro football, Taylor demanded not just a tactical response, but an explanation. Many people pointed to his unusual combination of size and speed. As one of the Redskins linemen put it, quote, "No human being should be 6'4", 245, and run a 4.540. Bill Parcells thought Taylor's size and speed were closer to the beginning than to the end of the explanation. New York Giants scouts were scouring the country for young men 6'3" or taller, 240 pounds or heavier, with speed. They could be found. In that pool of physical specimens, what was precious, far more precious than an inch or 10 pounds or 1/10 of a second, was Taylor's peculiar energy and mind, relentless, manic, with grandiose ambitions and private standards of performance. Parcells believed that even in the NFL, a lot of players were more concerned with seeming to want to win than actually winning, and that many of them did not know the difference. What they wanted deep down was to keep their jobs, make their money, and go home. Lawrence Taylor wanted to win. He expected more of himself on the field than a coach would dare to ask of any player. Parcells accumulated lots of anecdotal experience in support of his view of Taylor's football character. One of his favorites involved these very same Washington Redskins. Joe Gibbs, in a game in Giants Stadium, basically decided that Taylor wasn't going to make any plays, said Parcells. He put 2 tight ends on Taylor's side along with the left tackle, 2 wide receivers in the slot away from Taylor. This was extreme. An NFL football field is a tightly strung economy. Everything on it comes at a price. Take away from one place and you give to another. 3 men blocking Taylor meant 2 Giants with no one to block them. Taylor's effect on the game which the Giants won, was not obvious, but it was nonetheless great. But after the game, Parcells continued, the press sees that Lawrence doesn't have a sack and hasn't made a tackle, and they're all asking me, what's the matter with Taylor? The next week, we go out to San Diego to play the Chargers. Dan Henning is the coach. He sees the strategy, and they do the same thing. 2 tight ends on Lawrence, 2 wide receivers in the slot. Lawrence doesn't get a sack. We win again. But after the game, everyone's asking all over again, what's the matter with Taylor? I grab Lawrence in the locker room and say to him, quote, I'm going to change your first name from Lawrence to what's the matter with. I practiced that next week. He was what's the matter with. What you doing over there, what's the matter with? Hey, what's the matter with? How come you aren't making any plays? By Thursday, it's not funny to him. And I mean, it's really not funny. The next game is against the Vikings on Monday Night Football. Tommy Kramer is the quarterback. They don't employ the strategy. He knocks Kramer out of the game, causes 2 fumbles, and recovers one of them. I'm leaving the field, walking down the tunnel toward the locker room for the press conference, and out of nowhere, this thing comes and jumps on my back. I didn't know he was coming. He basically knocks me over, still got his helmet on. Sweat's still pouring down his face. He comes right up into my face and hollers, I tell you what, Coachy, they aren't going to ask you what's the matter with. Parcells believed Taylor's greatness was an act of will, a refusal to allow the world to understand him as anything less than great. He said, that's why I loved him so much. He responded to anything that threatened his status. When in the middle of his career, Taylor became addicted to cocaine, Parcells interpreted the problem as a simple extension of the man's character. Lawrence Taylor trusted in one thing, the power of his own will. He assumed that his will could control NFL football games and that it could also control his own chemical desires. He was right about the NFL games. By November 18, 1985, when the Giants went to Robert F. Kennedy Stadium in Washington, D.C. to play the Redskins, opposing teams have taken to lining up their players in new and creative ways simply to deal with him. The Redskins are a case in point. Early in the very first game in which the Redskins had faced this new force, back in 1981, Joe Gibbs had watched Taylor sprint past the blocker as if he wasn't there and clobber Joe Theismann from behind. Quote, I was standing there, said Gibbs, and I said, what? Did you see that? Oh, Lord. Gibbs had flopped about looking for a solution to this new problem and had come up with one. The one-back offense, a formation widely imitated in the NFL that uses one running back instead of 2. Until that moment, football offenses had typically used running backs to block linebackers who came charging after quarterbacks. But running backs were smaller, weaker, and surprisingly often, given their job description, slower than Lawrence Taylor. Lynn Kane, a running back for the Atlanta Falcons, was the first to dramatize the problem. The first time Kane went to block Taylor, he went in very low, got up underneath him, and sent Taylor flying head over heels. The next play, Kane tried it again and was carried off the field on a stretcher. People figured out very quickly that they could not block Lawrence with a running back, Parcells said. Then the question became, who do you block him with? Hence, Joe Gibbs' first solution, to remove the running back from the game and insert, across the line from Lawrence, a bigger, stronger tight end. The one-back offense. That will be the strategy tonight, but Joe Theismann knows too well its imperfections. Having that extra blocker to help the tackle addressed the problem, Theismann thought, without really solving it. Too often, Taylor came free. The week of practice leading up to the game had been a seminar on Lawrence Taylor. Theismann said, if you looked at our overhead projector or our chalkboard, all the other Giants players were X's or O's. Lawrence was the only one who had a number, 56. He was a little red 56, and the number was always highlighted and circled. The goal was, let's identify where Lawrence is on every play. Taylor moved around a lot to confuse the defense, but he and his coach were happiest when he came from his own right side and the quarterback's left. Bill Parcells said the big reason I put him over there is the right side is the quarterback's blind side, since most quarterbacks are right-handed, and no one wants to get his ass knocked off from the back side. Lawrence Taylor was more succinct. Quote, "Why the hell would I want to come from where he can see me?" But then he added, "It wasn't really called the blind side when I came into the league. It was called the right side. It became the blind side after I started knocking people's heads off." Where Taylor is at the start of the play, of course, isn't the problem. It's where he ends up. Theismann said, "When I dropped back, the first thing I did was to glance over my shoulder to see if he was coming. If he was dropping back in coverage, a sense of calm came over me. If he was coming, I had a sense of urgency." For Mississippi, Taylor's coming. From the snap of the ball, Theismann has lost sight of him. He doesn't see Taylor carving a wide circle behind his back. He doesn't see Taylor outrun his blocker upfield and then turn back down. And he doesn't see the blocker diving frantically at Taylor's ankles. He doesn't see Taylor's leap, both arms over his head, and fill the sky behind him. Theismann prides himself on his ability to stand in the pocket and disregard his fear. He thinks this quality is a prerequisite in a successful NFL quarterback. He says when a quarterback looks at the rush, his career is over. Theismann has played 163 straight games, a record for the Washington Redskins. He's led his team to 2 Super Bowls and won 1. He's 36 years old. He's certain he still has a few good years left in him. He's wrong. He has less than half a second. The game is on ABC's Monday Night Football. 17.6 million people have tuned in. Frank Gifford is in the booth, flanked by O.J. Simpson and Joe Namath. "Theismann's in a lot of trouble," the audience hears Gifford say just before Taylor's arms jackknife Theismann's head to his knees, and Taylor's torso pins Theismann right leg to the ground. 4 other players, including, oddly, the Redskins' John Riggins, pile on. They're good for dramatic effect, but practically irrelevant. The damage is done by Taylor alone. 196 pounds of quarterback come to rest beneath 1,000 or so pounds of other things. Then Lawrence Taylor pops to his feet and begins to scream and wave and clutch his helmet with both hands as if in agony. His reason is a mystery until ABC Sports clarifies the event by replaying it over and over again in slow motion. Frank Gifford says, "Again, we'll look at it with the reverse angle one more time. And I suggest if your stomach is weak, you just don't watch." People watched. The replay was almost surely better attended than the original play. Doug Flutie was probably a representative viewer. Flutie had just finished a glorious college quarterbacking career at Boston College and started a professional one in the USFL. One evening, November 18th, 1985, he was at home with his mother. She had the football game on. He had other things to do. "I heard my mother scream," he told a reporter, "and then I saw the replay. It puts fear in your heart and makes you wonder what the heck you're doing playing football." There's an instant before it collapses into some generally agreed upon fact when a football play, like a traffic accident, is all conjecture and fragments and partial views. Everyone wants to know the whole truth, but no one possesses it. Not the coach on the sidelines, not the coach in the press box, and certainly not the quarterback. No one can see the whole field and take in the movement of 22 bodies, with each his own job assignment. In baseball or basketball, all the players see more or less the same events. Points of view vary, but slightly. In football, many of the players on the field have absolutely no idea what happened, much less why it happened, until after the play is done. Even then, most of them will need to watch a videotape to be sure. The fans, naturally more interested in effect than cause, follow the ball and come away thinking they know perfectly well what just happened. But what happened to the ball and to the person holding the ball was just the final link in a chain of events that began well before the ball was snapped. At the beginning of the chain that ended Joe Theismann's career was an obvious question. Who was meant to block Lawrence Taylor? Two players will be treated, above all others, as the authorities on the play: Joe Theismann and Lawrence Taylor. The victim didn't have a view of the action. The perpetrator was so intent on what he was doing that he didn't stop to look. "The play was a blur," said Taylor. "I had taken the outside. I was thinking, keep him in the pocket and squeeze him. Then I broke free." Why he broke free, he couldn't say, as he didn't actually notice who was trying to block him. Theismann, when asked who was blocking Taylor on that play, will reply, Joe Jacoby, our left tackle. He won't blame Jacoby, as the guy was one of the 2 or 3 finest left tackles in the era. He was obviously just doing his best. And that's why it made no sense, in Joe Theismann's opinion, for an NFL team to blow big bucks on an offensive lineman. There was only so much a lineman can do, even when his name was Joe Jacoby. That was one point of view. Another was Jacoby's, who, on that night, was standing on the sidelines in street clothes. He'd strained ligaments in his knee and was forced to sit out. When Joe Jacoby played, he was indeed a splendid left tackle. 6'7", 315 pounds. He was shaped differently from most left tackles of his time. More like the left tackle of the future. Quote, "A freak of nature ahead of his time," his position coach, Joe Bugel, called him two decades later. Jacoby wasn't some lump of cement. He was an athlete. In high school, he'd been a star basketball player. He could run, he could jump, he had big, quick hands. Bugel said, "We put him at left tackle for one reason: to match him up against Lawrence Taylor." The first time they'd met, Jacoby had given Lawrence Taylor fits. He was a 300-pounder before the era of 300-pounders. With hands so big, they felt like hooks. Taylor had been forced to create a move just for Jacoby. Geritol, Taylor called it, because after the snap, Lawrence Taylor would try to look like an old man running up to him. Unable to overwhelm him physically, Lawrence Taylor sought to lull Jacoby into a tactical mistake. He'd come off the ball at a trot to lure Jacoby into putting his hands up before he reached him. The moment he did, wham! He would try to knock away Jacoby's hands before he latched on. A burst of violence, and he was off to the races. Still, Jacoby was one of the linemen that always gave Taylor trouble, because he was so big and so quick and so long. "The hardest thing for me to deal with," said Taylor, "was that big, agile left tackle." Offensive linemen were the stay-at-home mothers of the NFL. Everyone paid lip service to the importance of their contribution, yet hardly anyone could tell you exactly what that was. Well, that's rude. In 1985, the left tackle had no real distinction. He was still expected to believe himself more or less interchangeable with the other linemen. The Washington Redskins' offensive line was perhaps the most famous in NFL history, and had its own nickname, the Hogs. Fans dressed up as pigs in their honor, and yet they weren't understood, even by their own teammates, in the way running backs or quarterbacks were understood as individual players with particular skills. Even people who say they were fans of the Hogs had no idea who we were, said Jacoby. They couldn't tell the black ones from the white ones. I had people see me and scream, "Hey, May," who was a right tackle. Mark May was black, Jacoby was not. That night, with Jacoby out of the game, the Redskins moved Russ Grimm from his position at left guard to left tackle. Grim was 4 inches shorter, 30 pounds lighter, and far less agile than Jacoby. Quote, "Little Porky Grim," line coach Joe Bugle called him. As a result, Grim needed help, and he got it in the form of an extra tight end, a fellow named Don Warren. If Taylor made his move to the inside, Grim was expected to deal with him. If Taylor went on a wide loop outside, Grim was meant at most to punch him, to slow him down, and give Warren the time to stay with him. From his spot on the sidelines, Jacoby watched as Taylor went outside. Grim couldn't lay a hand on him, and so Warren was left alone with Taylor. Quote, "They weren't used to his speed," said Jacoby. "We watched Lawrence Taylor race upfield and leave Warren in the dust, then double back on the quarterback." Jacoby then heard what sounded like a gunshot. The tibia and fibula in Joe Theismann's right leg snapping beneath Taylor. He watched as Grim and Warren removed their helmets and walked quickly toward the sidelines like men fleeing the scene of a crime. He listened as Grim told him that Theismann's bone lay exposed and his blood was spurting straight up and in the air. Russ was a hunter. He'd gutted deer. And he said, "That is the most disgusting thing I have ever seen." Jacoby thought from the sidelines, it happened because I'm standing over here. And years later, he wouldn't be surprised that Theismann did not realize his great left tackle was standing on the sidelines. But that's why his leg got broken, he said. A few minutes later, 6 men bore Theismann on a stretcher to an ambulance. In ABC's booth, Joe Namath said, "I just hope it's not his last play in football." But it was. Nearly a year later, Joe Theismann would be wandering around the Redskins' locker room, unable to feel his big toe or push off his right leg. He had become a statistic. The American Journal of Sports Medicine article on the injuries to NFL quarterbacks between 1980 and 2001 would count Theismann's 2 broken bones as just one of a sample of 1,500, 77.4% of which occur, just as this one had, during games on passing plays. The game continued, and the Redskins surprisingly won, 28-23. And most people who did not earn their living in the NFL trying to figure out how to protect their increasingly expensive quarterbacks shoved the incident to the back of their minds. Not 10 minutes after Theismann was hauled off the field, Lawrence Taylor himself pounced on a fumble and ran to the bench, jubilant. Frank Gifford sought to persuade his audience that Taylor was still obviously feeling upset about what he had done to Joe Theismann, but the truth is, he didn't look at all upset. He looked as if he had already gotten over it. What didn't make sense on that night was Taylor's initial reaction. He leapt out of the pile like a man on fire. Those who had watched Taylor's career closely might have expected a bit more sang-froid in the presence of an injured quarterback. The destruction of Joe Theismann may have been classified an accident, but it wasn't an aberration. It was an extension of what Lawrence Taylor had been doing to NFL quarterbacks for 4.5 years. It wasn't even the first time Taylor had broken a quarterback's leg or ended a quarterback's career. In college, in the Gator Bowl, he had taken out the University of Michigan's quarterback John Wrangler. Before Taylor hit him, Wrangler had been a legitimate NFL prospect. "I was invited to try for the Lions and the Cowboys," Wrangler had said later. But everyone was kind of afraid of the severity of my injury. As it turned out, there was a simple explanation. Taylor was claustrophobic. His claustrophobia revealed itself in the way he played the game. Standing up looking for the best view, refusing to bend over and get down in the dirt with other players, preferring the long and open outside route to the quarterback over the short, tight one inside. It revealed itself also in the specific fear of being trapped at the bottom of a pile and not being able to escape. "That's what made me so frantic," he said. "I've already dreamed it. If I get on the bottom of a pile and I'm really hurt and I can't get out..." Now he lay at or near the bottom of a pile on top of a man whose leg he had broken so violently that the sound was heard by Joe Jacoby on the sidelines, and he just had to get out. He leapt to his feet, screaming, hands clutching the sides of his helmet. And the TV cameras didn't pick this up, lifting one foot unconsciously and rubbing his leg with it. It was the only known instance of Lawrence Taylor imagining himself into the skin of a quarterback he had knocked from a game. "We all have fears," Lawrence said. "We all have fears." Chapter 2. The Market for Football Players. Someone had sent Tom Leming a tape. But then Tom Leming received thousands of tapes from thousands of football coaches and parents who wanted their kids to make the various high school All-American teams he selected. He at least glanced at all of them, usually quickly. This tape was different. This tape he watched in wonder. He knew right away that this boy was a special case. He lived and played in Memphis, Tennessee, and Memphis was always rich in raw high school football talent, so that wasn't it. Leming said the tape was grainy and you couldn't see very well, but when he came off the line, it looked like one whole wall was moving, and it was just one player. You had to look at it twice to believe it. He was that big. And yet, he would get out and go chase down and catch these fast little linebackers. When I saw the tape, I guess I really didn't believe it. I saw how he moved, and I wondered how big he really was, because no one who's that big should be able to move that fast. It just wasn't possible, Leming said. As he drove into Memphis in March of 2004, Leming thought everything about Michael Oher, including his surname, was odd. He played for a small private school, the Briarcrest Christian School, with no history of generating Division I college football talent. The Briarcrest Christian School team didn't typically have black players either, and Michael Oher was black. But what made Michael Oher especially peculiar was that no one in Memphis had anything to say about him. Leming had plenty of experience, quote, discovering great players. Each year, he drove 50,000 miles, up to 60,000 miles, and met and grilled between 1,500 and 2,000 high school juniors. He got inside their heads months before the college recruiters were allowed to shake their hands. It didn't happen as much as it used to, but he still found future NFL stars to whom the recruiters were oblivious. For instance, no one outside of Newport News, Virginia had ever heard of Michael Vick, future number 1 pick in the entire NFL draft, and quarterback of the Atlanta Falcons. That is, before Leming stumbled upon him and wrote him up in his newsletter. But even in the case of Michael Vick, the people closest to him knew that he had talent. Michael Vick was no secret in Newport News, Virginia. Michael Oher was as good as invisible, even in Memphis, Tennessee. Leming asked around, and the local high school coaches didn't know who he was or didn't think he was any good. He hadn't made so much as a third-string all-city team. He hadn't had his name or picture in any newspaper. An internet search for Oher yielded nothing on him. The only proof of his existence was this grainy videotape. From the tape alone, Leming couldn't say how much Michael Oher had helped his team, just that he was big, fast, and fantastically explosive. Leming said, to make my lists, they almost always have to have production. By production, he meant honors and achievements, not mere potential. He was different from just about every other kid that Leming had picked to be a high school All-American, in that he didn't have any achievements or honors. But if Michael Oher, in flesh, was anything like Michael Oher on the videotape, Leming was not afraid to make an exception of him. He had his reputation to protect. Nothing was as embarrassing to him as leaving a kid off the lists who 4 years later was a first-round NFL draft pick. And the last time he had seen a player with this awesome array of physical gifts was back in 1993, when he went to the Sizzler Steakhouse in Sandusky, Ohio, and interviewed a high school junior working behind the counter named Orlando Pace. Michael Oher's athletic ability and his body, the only thing you could compare it to was Orlando Pace, said Leming. He kind of even looked like Orlando Pace. He wasn't as polished as Orlando, but Orlando wasn't Orlando in high school. Pace had gone from Leming's All-American team to Ohio State, where he'd played left tackle and won the Outland Award given to the nation's finest college offensive linemen. In 1997, Pace had signed the largest rookie contract in NFL history to play left tackle for the St. Louis Rams, and he was about to sign an even bigger one 7 years later, $52.8 million. Pace became and would remain the team's highest paid player, more highly than the star quarterback, Mark Bulger, the star running back, Marshall Faulk, and the star wide receiver, Isaac Bruce. He was an offensive lineman, but not just any offensive lineman. He protected the quarterback's blind side. When Tom Leming walked into the football meeting room at the University of Memphis looking for Michael Oher, the ghost of Lawrence Taylor was waiting. Taylor's legacy had led to a queasy tilting of the finances on the NFL's line of scrimmage. The players on the blind side of a right-handed quarterback, both offensive and defensive, became on average far more highly paid than the players on the visible side. This was strange. There was no financial distinction between left and right guards. Right side linebackers who, unlike Taylor, routinely played off the line of scrimmage, continued to be paid the same, on average, as left side linebackers. Right side cornerbacks, even further from the line of scrimmage, were paid the same as the left side cornerbacks. Only the two players engaged in the battle for control of the turf between the line of scrimmage and the right-handed quarterback's back were paid more than their counterparts on the side that the typical right-handed quarterback faced. And it was a lot more. By 2004, the 5 most highly paid NFL left tackles were earning nearly $3 million a year more than the 5 most highly paid right tackles, and more than the 5 most highly paid running backs and wide receivers. The fantastic general rise in overall NFL salaries since 1993, when players were granted the right of free agency, obscured a more striking shift in relative pay. The players all made so much more money each year than they had the year before that few paid much attention to the trends within the trend. But there were several, and this was the most revelatory. In the early 1980s, the notion that a single lineman should be paid much more than any other, and more than star running backs, wide receivers, and, in some cases, quarterbacks, would have been considered heretical had it not been so absurd. The offensive line never abandoned, at least in public, its old, vaguely socialistic ideology. All for one and one for all. As to do our jobs well, we must work together, and thus no one of us is especially important. But by the mid-1990s, the market disagreed. It had declared this one member of the offensive line a superstar. Not some interchangeable homunculus, not low-skilled labor, but a rare talent. This judgment was not rendered overnight. It was the end of a long story of football coaches and general managers sifting and judging and scrambling to determine the relative importance of the positions on a football field, and to find the people best suited to play them. And at the beginning of the story was Tom Leming. Back in 1978, at the age of 23, Leming had an idea. He would travel America and meet the top high school football players in the country and decide which ones were the best. There was no videotape, so he had to visit high schools and ask to see the 16mm film of their players. While there, he would interview the players, get a sense of their characters, and extract from them everything from their college preference to their grade point averages. Then he'd publish a book ranking them. I had such excitement knowing I was doing something no one else was doing, Leming said later. No one had ever gone to see everyone in the country. When he drove away from his home in Chicago, he had to wonder who was going to pay for this bizarre enterprise. No one, at first. In the early days, he spent every other night sleeping in his car at an Oasis truck stop. But then people started shooting people in the Oasises, so I had to find different places to park. The first year, his budget allowed him to meet and interview every notable high school football player east of the Mississippi. The next year, he crossed the Mississippi and went right to the base of the Rockies. I would go as far as my cash would take me, he said. I was sort of like Lewis and Clark, except instead of waiting for resupply, I was waiting for enough radio shows to promote my books. In 1983, he crossed the Rockies and never looked back. It took him 7 years to turn a profit, but by then, he had a frantic following in college football. What must have seemed at first a mad notion, why would anyone care what some 23-year-old guy with no experience thought about high school football players? Why would any high schooler waste his time answering the questions of a stranger, filling out intrusive forms? It became a thriving business. Bear Bryant, Dan Devine, Bo Schembechler, all these big-time football coaches took an interest in Leming's work. He was, in effect, the only national football scout in America. Baseball had hundreds of scouts, guys who spent 365 days a year traveling the country to evaluate teenagers. Strictly speaking, of course, a 16-year-old football player wasn't a commodity in the way a 16-year-old baseball player was. A high school baseball player could be drafted to play in the pros. A high school football player could not. Less strictly speaking, high school football players were far more highly prized, in part because colleges could usurp a great deal of their skyrocketing market value. 8 times a year, Leming published a newsletter to which all but 7 of the 117 D1 college football programs subscribed. After they read it, all these college football coaches would call Leming for the kids' addresses, phone numbers, and anything else he might know about them. High school football players across the country, with the help of their fathers and their coaches, inundated Leming's little office in Chicago with tapes of their performances, press clippings, and letters of recommendation. All they wanted was for him to make them famous. There simply was no one else doing what Leming was doing. Overnight, he became, by default, the leading independent authority on the subject of U.S. high school football players. It was a booming market with an obvious gap. Colleges on one side of the country had no information about players on the other. Even in the lawless days of football recruiting before the NCAA began seriously cracking down, that was in the late 80s, recruiters from big-time college football schools hunted for talent mostly in their own backyards. Coach Bear Bryant's machine at the University of Alabama spent its time and energies on Southern players. Bo Schembechler's machine at the University of Michigan spent its time and energy on players in the Midwest. In the late 1980s, when the NCAA began to pass and enforce elaborate rules governing the interaction between college football coaches and high school football players, the hole in the market widened. College football coaches were forbidden to so much as wink at a prospect until he began his senior year. By then, Leming had studied the prospect's play, his character, and his grade point average. Plus, he'd have a pretty good idea of where the kid might actually like to go to college. The flow of information improved. Videotape, cell phones, the internet, all made his life a lot easier. And Leming's ability to make sense of all of this new technology improved as well. When he started out, he felt he had been too impressed by sheer physical talent and insufficiently respectful of actual on-field achievement. He thought future great NFL running back Barry Sanders was too small, for instance, even though he'd run for a zillion yards in high school. He still made mistakes, but fewer. By the 1990s, Tom Leming had a vast, informal network of informants who he trusted, high school coaches and fans mainly, who allowed him to shrink the pool of 3 million high school football players down to a few thousand. He watched tapes of those players and winnowed the pool to about 1,500, whom he interviewed in person. From those, he selected 400 for his annual book of the nation's top prospects, and from the book, he culled his list of the top 100 players in the nation. Finally, he selected his most rarefied group, the 25 or so high school football players he pronounced, quote, all Americans. His hit rate was very high. Of the 25 players he picked in 1995, for instance, 14 wound up becoming number 1 draft choices in the NFL. In the mid-1990s, ESPN began to publish an All-American team selected by Leming. USA Today published another one, also mainly selected by Leming. In 2000, the U.S. Army High School All-American Football Game was born and broadcast on national television. Leming selected the 80 players for the game: Reggie Bush, Vince Young, Adrian Peterson, Dwayne Jarrett, Chris Leak, Lindale White, Brady Quinn. The game became a turnstile for future Heisman Trophy candidates and top NFL draft picks. As the noise grew louder and the money got bigger, the politics became worse. Coaches and players pestered Leming to be included in his books and on his lists and in the game. At some point, he basically ceased to believe what anyone told him about a high school football player. He said, "There's a reason I'm on the road 6 months a year. I would never rely on what people tell me. I have to see them." By the spring of 2004, he found himself interviewing the sons of players he had interviewed 25 years earlier. His business and his influence grew, but Leming kept on doing what he'd always done. He still drove 50 to 60,000 miles each year and interviewed in the flesh between 1,500 and 2,000 high school football players. He was a one-man sifting machine. One of the perks of Leming's role in the market was a worm's eye view of its trends. When he opened for business, he assumed he was simply identifying future college football stars. He didn't give much thought to their professional futures. College football was mainly a running game, for instance, and the NFL increasingly was a passing game. College football had an appetite for all sorts of players, and the pros had no use for option quarterbacks, slow fullbacks, small linebackers. That changed as the big-time football programs came to function as training schools for the NFL. To attract the best high school players, they had to persuade them that they offered the smoothest path to the NFL. It helped, then, if they ran NFL-style offenses and defenses. Because of this, and because of the steady flow of NFL coaches into college football became more homogeneous and less distinguishable from the game played in the NFL. In the late 1980s, Leming began to notice the erosion in the differences between college and pro football. By the mid-1990s, he saw that in identifying the best future college football players, he was identifying the best future professional ones too. The other related trend was a trickle-down of NFL prototypes into America's high schools. The NFL would discover a passion for athletic, which read as black, quarterbacks, or speedy pass rushers, and first the colleges and then the high schools would begin to supply them. There was a lag, of course. If Lawrence Taylor created a new vogue in the NFL for exceptionally violent and speedy pass rushers with his dimensions in 1981, it might be 1986 before Leming encountered a big new wave of similarly shaped, violent, and speedy high school pass rushers. But the wave always came. What the NFL prized? America's high schools supplied, and America's colleges processed. It goes from Sunday to Saturday to Friday, 5 years later, said Leming. The types came and went. One decade there would be a vogue for speedy little receivers, and the next decade the demand would be for tall, lanky receivers. And there were anti-types. Lord help the white running back, or the wide receiver, or, until the early 90s, the black quarterback. The Lawrence Taylor type, however, came and never left. When Leming hit the road in 2004, he knew he would find big linebackers and small defensive ends, whose chief future use would be to wreak havoc with the minds and bodies of quarterbacks. He also knew that he'd find the type that had arisen across the line of scrimmage in response, the guy who could stop the Lawrence Taylor type, the left tackle type. When Tom Leming looked at left tackles, he thought in terms of others he had selected for his All-American teams who went on to be stars in the NFL. Jonathan Ogden, Orlando Pace, Walter Jones, Willie Roaf. These people looked nothing like most human beings or even the players Leming interviewed in the late 70s and 80s. 250 pounds used to be huge for a high school lineman. Now you got to be 300 pounds or no one will even look at you. Even in this land of giants, the left tackle type stood out. Freak of nature. When he found one of these rare beasts, that's the phrase that popped into Leming's mind to describe him. When Leming put high school junior Jonathan Ogden on the cover of his annual prep report, Ogden was 6'9" tall and weighed 320 pounds. He'd fill out in college. When he did the same with Orlando Pace, Pace stood 6'6" and weighed 310 pounds and hadn't stopped growing. The ideal left tackle was big, but a lot of people were big. What set him apart were his more subtle specifications. He was wide in the ass and massive in the thighs. The girth of his lower body lessened the likelihood that Lawrence Taylor or his successors would run right over him. He had long arms. Pass rushers tried to get in tight to the blocker's body, then spin off it, and long arms helped to keep them at bay. He had giant hands so that when he grabbed a hold of you, it meant something. But size alone could not cope with the threat to the quarterback's blind side, because that threat was also fast. The ideal left tackle also had great feet, incredibly nimble and quick feet. Quick enough feet, ideally, that the idea of racing him in a 5-yard dash made the team's running backs uneasy. He had the body control of a ballerina and the agility of a basketball player. The combination was just incredibly rare and so ultimately very expensive. The price of protecting quarterbacks was driven by the same forces that drove the price of other kinds of insurance. It rose with the value of the asset insured, with the risk posed to that asset. Quarterbacks had become wildly expensive. Even the rookie quarterback contracts now included huge guarantees. The San Francisco 49ers had agreed to pay Alex Smith $56 million over 7 years. And if his career ended tomorrow, they'd still owe him $24 million. The New York Giants were paying their young quarterback Eli Manning $54 million for his first 7 years of service. If an injury ended his career, they were still on the line for $20 million. The highest paid NFL quarterback, Eli's brother, Peyton Manning of the Indianapolis Colts, had a 7-year contract worth $99.2 million. Several others made nearly $10 million a year. The money wasn't all guaranteed, but a career-ending injury still cost an NFL franchise millions of dollars. If Peyton Manning suffered a career-ending injury, the Colts were out of pocket about half their entire 2005 payroll. And those lost dollars would be but a fraction of the Colts' misery. There would also be the cost of playing without their star quarterback. When a star running back or wide receiver is injured, the coaches worry about their game plans. When a star quarterback gets hurt, the coaches worry about their jobs. Their anxiety came to be reflected in the pay of left tackles. By the 2004 NFL season, the average NFL tackle salary was $5.5 million a year, and the left tackle had become the second highest paid position in the field after the quarterback. In one Super Bowl played February 5th, 2006, the highest paid player on the field was Seattle quarterback Matt Hasselbeck, who had just signed a new 6-year deal worth $8.2 million a year. The second highest paid player on the field was a man who protected Hasselbeck's blind side, a left tackle, Walter Jones, who made $7.5 million a year. The closest Steeler trailed by $1.9 million. The other force that drove the price of quarterback insurance was the supply of human beings who could possibly provide it. There weren't many people on the planet, and only a few in the NFL, with Walter Jones's combination of size, speed, agility, hands, feet, and arms. Jonathan Ogden, Orlando Pace, maybe Chris Samuels of the Redskins. They were the prototypes. And it was these men, Walter Jones, and the few NFL left tackles of his caliber that Tom Leming had in mind when he arrived in Memphis in March of 2004 and went looking for Michael Oher. Even more than usual, Leming needed to see this kid. It just smelled fishy. There was no way an American high school player in 2004 with this kind of talent could be such a mystery. Film occasionally deceived. Maybe he wasn't as big as he looked. Maybe there was something seriously defective about his character. Football was a team game. There was a limit to the pathological behavior it would tolerate, especially in a high school player. Baseball can tolerate a Barry Bonds, said Leming. In football, you never do anything alone. Even though you're Joe Montana, you still need a Jerry Rice and the 9 other guys on offense if you're going to be any good. That's why NFL receiver Terrell Owens got himself in so much trouble. He thought he was bigger than the game, and no one player is bigger than the game. Leming had seen hundreds of NFL caliber players with social problems come to inglorious ends. In 1995, Leming picked as a first-team high school All-American a sensational defensive end from Louisiana named Eric Jefferson. Jefferson signed to play football for the University of Illinois, and Leming and a lot of other people couldn't see him as anything but a future NFL star. Before he played a down of college football, he pled guilty to armed robbery and is now serving a 5-year sentence in a California state prison. In 1996, a Chicago kid named Michael Burden had been easily the nation's most promising defensive back, a future NFL star without a doubt, when he was charged with RAPE. Ohio State still took him, and he even played a year, but then he got in trouble at school and vanished without a trace. In 1997, a defensive lineman named Boo Boo Williams had been the most likely future NFL player in the nation. He was the next Reggie White, said Leming, referring to the Hall of Fame pass rusher for the Green Bay Packers. But as a junior in high school, Boo Boo was 6'5", 265 pounds, ran a 4.740, and bench pressed 375 pounds, despite never lifting weights. He had not merely won the heavyweight state wrestling championship, he'd picked up the runner-up, a 220-pound star running back, and lifted him straight over his head, then tossed him to the ground. Boo Boo Williams was the most promising player in a graduating class that included all kinds of future NFL stars. But Boo Boo's grades were so bad, he was required to sit out of college ball. Not just 1, but 2 years. Then Boo Boo also vanished. Poof. And so it went in football. The game attracted the very people most likely to get in trouble outside the game. Aggressive people. Leming was wary of kids with bad grades, criminal records, or anything else that suggested that they'd never get into college, much less get through it. To play in the NFL for money, it was practically necessary to play 3 years in college for free. It was true, as Leming put it, that there are some colleges that would take a Charles Manson if he could run a 4.40 and get his work release. Their existence didn't prevent the premature end of a shocking number of potentially lucrative careers. After he'd seen Michael Oher's tape, Leming tried to reach the kid by phone. He found out that his surname was pronounced Oher, but that's about all he learned. He was accustomed to the social lives of high school football stars. The handlers, the harems, the informal advisors, the coaches. The kids Leming sought to meet were not typically hard to find. This kid not only had no handlers, he didn't appear to exist outside of school. He had no home. He didn't even have a phone number. Or so said the Briarcrest Christian School when Leming called looking for Michael Oher. They had been mystified by Leming's interest in their student, but they were also polite and finally agreed to have someone drive Michael over to the University of Memphis football facility for a face-to-face interview. I'll never forget when he walked into the room, says Leming. He looked like a house walking into a bigger house. He walked in the door and he barely fit through the door. He wasn't just huge. He was huge in exactly the right ways. There was the big blob, 300-pounder, and there's the solid kind, said Leming. He was the solid kind. You also see big guys, tall guys who weigh a lot, but they have thin legs. They're fine in high school, but in college they get pushed around. He was just massive everywhere. What happened next was the strangest encounter of Leming's 27-year football scouting career. Michael Oher sat down at the table across from him and refused to speak. He shook my hand and then didn't say a word, said Leming. His hands, they were huge. Leming asked the usual questions. What colleges are you interested in? What do you want to major in? Where do you think you'll be in 10 years? All of these questions were met with total silence. Not knowing what else to do, Leming handed the kid his questionnaire. Michael Oher looked at it and put it to one side. Leming then handed him the ultimate prize, the form to play in the U.S. Army High School All-Star football game. Michael Oher looked at it and also put it to the side. Leming said he noticed his arms were really long at that point. Leming asked, "You want to fill it out or not?" Michael Oher just shrugged. In hopes of generating some kind of a response, Leming asked what he assumed was a simple question. So do you want to play in the Army game or not? It was the equivalent of asking a 4-year-old if he'd like a lifetime supply of ice cream. But Michael Oher didn't say yes or no. He made some sound of total indifference. First guy ever to say that, said Leming. First and last. Leming decided further interaction was pointless. Michael Oher left and left behind blank forms and unanswered questions. In the past 26 years, Leming had interviewed between 40 and 50,000 high school football players. Never, not once, had a player simply refused to talk to him or declined to fill out his forms. They begged the answer to the questions and fill in his forms. Once, a player had the audacity to delegate the form filling to a coach, and it left a bad taste in Leming's mouth. That incident had occurred in this very room, in Memphis, Tennessee. The player was named Albert Means. Albert Means' sure-thing career had gone up in smoke after the NCAA discovered a University of Alabama booster had paid his high school coaches $150,000 to guide him to Alabama, and the Crimson Tide spent the next 2 seasons on probation. Leming didn't exactly write off Michael Oher, but he put him to one side with a mental asterisk beside his name. I thought he was trouble, Leming said. It's not only size and strength and speed and athletic ability in football. Football is an emotional game. It's about aggression, tenacity, and heart. I didn't have any idea what was in his heart. I got no sense of anything about him. If Leming picked 20 high school All-Americans, he expected 10 of them to fulfill their potential. The other 10 would be lost to injury or crime or bad grades or drugs. The sponsor of the U.S. Army All-American game worried a great deal about their good name. Every year there was a player or two they declined to invite because they didn't want dope in their rooms, or criminal records on their rosters, or even boorish behavior. Michael Oher fell into that category, Leming decided. A character risk. Still, he couldn't deny his talent. I didn't hold a grudge, said Leming. He wasn't rude to me, and I did try to go with the best players. I thought he could be the best offensive lineman to come out of the South in the last 5 years. He was an instant All-American. I saw him as a #1 NFL draft choice, playing left tackle. But there was no way he'd invite Michael Oher to play in the U.S. Army All-American game. What never crossed Tom Leming's mind was that the player he would rank the #1 offensive lineman in the nation and perhaps the finest left tackle prospect since Orlando Pace hadn't the faintest idea who Leming was or why he was asking him all these questions. For that matter, he didn't even think of himself as a football player, and he'd never played left tackle in his life. Chapter 3. Crossing the Line. When Big Tony put the 2 boys in his car on the west side of Memphis and drove them out, he was taking the longest journey he could imagine, and yet he only had to travel about 15 miles. Driving east, he left the 3rd poorest zip code in the United States and headed towards some of the richest people on earth. He left a neighborhood in which he could drive all day without laying eyes on a white person, for one where a black person was a bit of a curiosity. Memphis could make you wonder why anyone ever bothered to create laws segregating races. More than 1 million people, making many millions of individual choices, generated an outcome not so different from a law forbidding black people and white people from mingling. As Tony, Big Tony, puttered along in his ancient Ford Taurus, he passed what was left of Hurt Village, a barracks-style housing project built for white working-class families in the mid-50s, reoccupied by black individuals and, in the end, controlled by gangs. Hurt Village is where Big Tony had grown up. He passed schools that had once been all white and were now all black. He passed people like himself in old clothes driving old cars. He passed Second Presbyterian Church from which Martin Luther King Jr. staged his last march before he was shot and killed, now abandoned and boarded shut. Further east, he passed the relatively prosperous black church, Mississippi Boulevard, housed in a building abandoned by the white Baptists when they fled further east, to a new church, so huge and sprawling that it had been dubbed 6 Flags Over Jesus. Even God, in the west end of Memphis, felt like a hand-me-down. As Big Tony drove east, he left what was, in effect, a second-hand city, occupied by black people, and entered the place for which it had been exchanged. A brand new city, created by born-again white people. And now, here came Big Tony, chugging along in his beat-to-hell Taurus, chasing after them. Everyone called him Big Tony. His actual name was Tony Henderson, because he stood 6'3" and weighed 400 pounds. It was in Big Tony's nature to cross lines, if for no other reason than when he looked down, he couldn't see him. But today he had a motive. His mother had died, and her dying wish had been for him to go east. Big Tony's mother's name was Betty, but she went by Betty Boo. Right up until Big Tony reached the 6th grade, Betty Boo had been the party girl of Hurt Village. She smoked, she drank, she ran around. But suddenly, in 1973, she gave up alcohol, then her 3-pack-a-day cigarette habit, then sin itself. She announced she had been saved and accepted Jesus Christ as her Lord and Savior, and spent most of the next 25 years mailing pamphlets and pressing Christian literature and videos into people's hands. She wasn't tedious about it, though, and all the kids in Hurt Village called her Grandma. Her first real grandson was Tony's son, Stephen. As Betty Boo lay dying in the early summer of 2002, she asked Tony for one thing, that he take Stephen out of the public school and get him a Christian education. She wanted her grandson to become a preacher. Big Tony would have preferred Stephen to become an NBA point guard, but he didn't consider Betty Boo's request unreasonable. Stephen was one of the best students in his class. He always had been. There wasn't any difficulty in Memphis finding a school that offered a Christian education. The nation's largest private school system had sprung up in the mid-70s in East Memphis to do just that. The problem was that Stephen wasn't the only child living in Tony's small house. Occasionally, one of the boys from the Hurt Village would crash on his floor, but a few months before, a boy came to stay the night and he never left. His name was Michael Oher, but everyone just called him Big Mike. Tony liked Big Mike, but he could also see that Big Mike was heading at warp speed toward a bad end. He just finished the 9th grade at a public school, but Tony very much doubted he'd be returning for the 10th. He seldom attended classes, showed no talent or interest in school. Big Tony said Big Mike was going to drop out, and if he dropped out, he'd be like all his friends who dropped out, dead, in jail, or on the street selling drugs, just waiting to be dead or in jail. Tony decided that as long as he was taking Stephen out on this search for a Christian education, he should take Big Mike too. Just a few days after he buried his mother, he put Stephen and Big Mike in his car and drove east. White Memphis had use for a great variety of Christian schools. Harding Christian Academy, which had been around forever, Christian Brothers, which was Catholic and all male, and the evangelical Christian school known as ECS. ECS was as close to a church as a school could get. ECS wouldn't accept kids unless both parents gave testimony of their experience of being born again, and the stories better be good. Finally, and furthest east, was Briarcrest Christian School. Briarcrest, also evangelical, was as far east as you could get and still be in Memphis. Briarcrest, more than the others, had been created to get away from Big Tony. From the point of view of its creators, Briarcrest was a miracle. Its founder, Wayne Allen, had long been distressed by the absence of the Bible from public schools. The white outrage over busing was a chance to do something about it. In the year after the court decision, on January 24, 1973, that forced the city to deploy 1,000 buses to integrate the public schools, the parents of white children yanked more than 7,000 children out of those schools. From the ashes arose an entire spanking new private school system. The Briarcrest Christian School, originally named Briarcrest Baptist School, was by far the biggest. It was a system into itself. 15 different campuses inside 15 different Baptist churches. Its initial enrollment was just shy of 3,000 children, and every last one of them was white. By the summer of 2002, Briarcrest had just a handful of black students, but these tended to be, like the black families in the fancy white neighborhoods, imports from elsewhere. The school had existed in East Memphis for nearly 30 years, and yet no one who worked there could recall a poor black person from the west side of Memphis marching through its front door to enroll his child. Big Tony was the first. All Tony knew about Briarcrest was that John Harrington was the basketball coach who had coached in the public schools where Tony had met him. But any doubt that Briarcrest Christian School served up the sort of education Betty Boo had in mind was allayed by the sight of the passage from the book of Matthew inscribed on the outside of the main building. With men, this is possible. With God, all things are possible. Two very lost-looking boys at his heels, Big Tony, marched beneath it and inside the building and went hunting for the basketball coach. John Harrington had spent 2 decades coaching in the public schools and was about to begin his first year ever at Briarcrest. When Big Tony walked into his office unannounced, Harrington knew he couldn't do anything for him. The problem presented by Big Tony was too large for the new guy. They chatted for a few minutes, Then Harrington sent him over to see their senior coach at Briarcrest, Hugh Freeze. Freeze was only 33, and with his white blonde hair and unlined face, might have passed for even younger than he was, if he weren't so shrewd. His shrewdness was right on the surface, so it had an innocent quality to it. But it was there just the same. Slow to speak and quick to notice, Hugh Freeze had the gifts of a machine politician. He was a man of God. If he hadn't been a football coach, he said, he'd have liked to have been a preacher. But he was also very obviously adept at getting his way on earth without any help from the Almighty. He coached at Briarcrest for 8 years. He'd taken the boys' football team to the Tennessee State Championship game 5 years in a row, and the girls' basketball team to the last 7 state championship games, where they had won 4 of them. This year, his girls were ranked 9th in the nation. Freeze was at his desk preparing for the first day of the new school year when his secretary alerted him to the presence of someone who insisted on calling himself Big Tony. In walks this 400-pound black man in a mechanic's shirt with a little white name tag that says, Big Tony. This huge man introduces himself as Big Tony, again, no last name, and proceeds to tell Hugh about Stephen, his son. Coach Freeze said he told me about his son and how he wanted more for him than the school he was at. I told him how admirable that was, but he had to understand it cost a lot of money to go to Briarcrest, and not everyone got in. You had to have good grades. But Big Tony said he knew about the cost and the grades. Stephen was an honor student, and he was able to pay whatever the financial aid didn't cover. Freeze gave him the financial aid forms and thought, good luck. And that's when Tony said, and Coach, I've also got one of Stephen's friends. He told him about Big Mike, a basketball player who, in Big Tony's modest opinion, might also be of use to the Briarcrest football team. Where are his parents? Asked Freeze. He felt a twinge of interest. If a man who weighed 400 pounds was referring to someone else as Big Mike, he'd like to see the size of that someone else. It's a bad deal, Coach, said Big Tony. No dad, mom's in rehab. I'm pretty much all he has. Who's the guardian? Asked Freeze. Who has legal authority over him? The mom, Big Tony said. He said he could get Big Mike's mom to fill out the forms. Then he just sat there a bit uneasily. Finally he asked, You want to meet him? The boys are here? Coach Freeze said. Right outside, said Big Tony. Sure, said Freeze. Bring him on in. Tony went out and came back with Stephen. Hugh sized him up, almost 6 feet, maybe as much as 180. Plenty big enough for the Briarcrest Christian School Saints football team. But where's the other one? The coach asked. Big Mike, come on in here. Hugh Freeze will never forget the next few seconds. He just peeks around the corner with his head down. Hugh didn't get a good look at first. It was just a sliver of him, but it suggested an improbably large hole. Then Michael Oher stepped around the corner and into his office. Good God, he's a monster! The phrase shrieked inside Hugh's brain. He'd never seen anything remotely like this kid, and he'd coached against players who had gone to the NFL. When football coaches describe their bigger players, they sound like ranchers discussing a steer. They use words like girth and mass and trunk size. Hugh wasn't exactly sure of the exact dimensions of Mike. 6'5", 330 pounds, maybe. Whatever the dimensions, they just could not do justice to the effect they created. That mass, that girth. The kid's shoulders and ass were as wide as the doorway, and he'd only just turned 16. How can I get their transcripts? Asked Hugh. Big Tony said he'd go and get them and bring them in person. Then Hugh tried to make conversation with this man-child. I couldn't get him to talk to me, not a word. He was in a shell. A few days later, Big Tony delivered the transcripts to Hugh Freeze. Stephen, as advertised, was a model student, and Briarcrest could see no reason not to supply him with a Christian education. Big Mike was another story. Hugh was a football coach, and so he tended to take an indulgent view of bad grades, but he had no pleasant category in his mind for Big Mike's. I knew it was too good to be true, he said. He sat on the transcript for 2 days, but he knew eventually he'd have to hand it over to Mr. Simpson, the principal, to pass judgment. But his wheels were already spinning. Steve Simpson, like John Harrington, was new to Briarcrest. He'd spent 30 of his 56 years working in the Memphis public school system. When you first meet him, you thought that whatever happened next, it wasn't likely to be pleasant. His social manner was, like his salt and pepper hair, clipped short. He had the habit of frowning when another would have smiled and of taking a joke seriously. But after about 20 minutes, you realized that through the hard surface was both thin and brittle, and beneath was a pudding of a sentiment and emotion. He teared up easily and was quick to empathize. When you mentioned his name to people who knew him well, they often said things like, "Steve Simpson has a heart that barely fits in this building." When teachers came to Briarcrest from the public schools, they often felt liberated and took great pleasure in advertising their Christian faith. When Simpson arrived to this new place, he placed front and center on his desk a framed passage from the Bible that he never would have placed on his public school desk. But it was special to him. And God is able to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough of everything, you may share abundantly in his good works. 2 Corinthians 9:8. Still, when the file on Michael Oher came from the Memphis city school system, Simpson was frankly incredulous. The boy had a measured IQ of 80, which put him in mankind's 9th percentile. An aptitude test he had taken in the 8th grade had measured his ability to learn and ranked him in the 6th percentile. The numbers looked like misprints. In a rich white private school, under the column marked percentile, you never saw single digits of numbers. Of course, logically, you knew such people must exist, but for someone to be in the 99th percentile, someone else had to be in the first. But you didn't expect to meet them at Briarcrest Christian School. Academically, Briarcrest might not be the most ambitious school. It spent more time and energy directing its students to Jesus than to Harvard. But the students all went to college, and they all had at least an average IQ. In his first 9 years of school, Michael Oher had been enrolled in 11 different institutions, and that included a whole of 18 months around the age of 10, when apparently he did not attend school at all. Either that or the public schools were so indifferent to his presence that they neglected to register it formally. But it was worse than that. There were schools Big Tony mentioned that did not appear on the transcripts. Their absence might be explained by another shocking fact. The boy was seldom showing up at the schools where he was enrolled. Even when he received credit for attending, he was sensationally absent. 46 days of a single term in his first grade year, for instance. His first grade year, that is. His first grade year, that is. Michael Oher repeated first grade. He'd repeated second grade, too. And yet, Memphis city schools describe these early years as the most accomplished of his academic career. They claim that right through the 4th grade, he was performing at, quote, grade level. How could they know when, according to these transcripts, he hadn't even attended the 3rd grade? Simpson knew what everyone who had even a brief brush with the Memphis public school system knew. They passed kids up to the next grade because they found it too much trouble to flunk them. They functioned as an assembly line, churning out products never meant to be market tested. At several schools, Michael had been given Fs in reading in first term and C's the second term, which allowed him to finish the school year with what was clearly an ignoramus's D. They were giving him grades just to get rid of him, to keep the assembly line moving. And get rid of him they did. Seldom had the boy returned to the school that had passed him the year before. His previous year, in the 9th grade, he spent at a high school called Westwood, According to his transcripts, he'd missed 50 days of school. 50 days. Briarcrest had a rule that if a student missed 15 days of any class, he had to repeat the class, no matter what his grade was. And yet, Westwood had given Michael Oher just enough D's to move him along. When you threw a B in the world geography, clearly a gift from the Westwood basketball coach who taught the class, the grade point average the boy would bring home, and ultimately with him to Briarcrest, began with a 0. 0.6. If there was a less promising academic record, Mr. Simpson hadn't seen it. Not in 3 decades of working with public school students. Mr. Simpson guessed rightly that the Briarcrest Christian School hadn't seen anything like Michael Oher either. And yet, here he was, courtesy of the football coach, seated across the desk, staring hard at the floor. Michael seemed as lost as a Martian stumbling out of a crash landing. The principal tried to shake his hand, but he didn't know how to do it. I had to show him how to shake hands. Every question Simpson asked elicited a barely audible mumble. I don't know if docile is the right word, Simpson said later. He seemed completely intimidated by authority, almost nonverbal. That in itself, Simpson found curious. Even though Michael Oher had no business applying to Briarcrest, he showed courage just being there. It was really unusual to see a kid with those kinds of deficits that wanted an education, to want to be in this environment. A lot of kids with his background wouldn't come within 200 miles of this place. The disposition of Michael Oher's application to Briarcrest was Steve Simpson's decision, and normally he would have had no trouble making it. An empathetic guy, but a gusty rejection. Beneath the crest of the Briarcrest Christian School was the motto, decidedly academic, distinctly Christian. Michael Oher was, it seemed to Simpson, neither. But Mr. Simpson was new to the school, and this great football coach, Hugh Freeze, had phoned Simpson's boss, the school president, who was also a football fan, and made his pitch. This wasn't a thing you did for the Briarcrest football team, Freeze had said. This was a thing you did because it was right. Briarcrest was this kid's last chance. The president, in turn, phoned Simpson and told him that if he felt right with it, he could admit Michael. Simpson thought it over and said, "Sorry, there's just no chance Michael Oher can cut it in the 10th grade. The 4th grade might be a stretch for him." But the pressure from the football coach, coupled with a little twinge inside his own heart, led Simpson to reject the applicant gently. There was just something about the boy's desire to be here, he said. I just couldn't justify sending him away without any hope. He granted a single concession. If Michael Oher enrolled in a home study program based in Memphis called the Gateway Christian School and performed at a high level for a semester, Briarcrest would admit him the following semester. Simpson knew there wasn't much chance that Gateway would pass him, and he suspected that he would never hear from the football coach or Michael Oher again. He was wrong. 2 months later, 6 weeks into the school year, his phone rang. It was Big Tony. It was a sad sight. Big Tony said he was watching Big Mike stare at these books that were sent to him by the Gateway Christian School without any ability to make heads or tails of them. Big Tony didn't have the time or energy to work with Big Mike, and Mike was trying so hard, but he was getting nowhere. And now it was too late for him to enroll in a public school. So what should they do now? That's whenever Mr. Simpson realized he had made a mistake. In effect, he had removed a boy from the public school system. He tried to handle this problem the easy way for him, and it had backfired. It was one of those things, Simpson said. I should have said, you don't qualify, and there's no chance you'll ever qualify. When Big Tony called back, I thought, man, look, what have I done to these people? I sent them out here with false hope. He went to the Briarcrest president, Tim Hillen, and told him that he had made a big mess for these people. Then he called Michael Oher, who appeared to still be living with Big Tony, and said, we're going to take a chance on you, but you're not going to play ball. The message was delivered simultaneously to Hugh Freeze. No football, No basketball. The kid couldn't even sing in the choir until he proved to the school that he could handle the schoolwork. Michael didn't say much at all in response. But that didn't matter to Mr. Simpson. My conscience would be clear if we gave him a chance, he said. His thoughts turned to the teachers. How would he explain this mess to them? Jennifer Graves had run Briarcrest program for students with special needs for 9 years. I decided early on in my life, she said, that Christ was calling me to work with the kids who did not have it so easy. But her mission took on a different and less hopeful tone when 6 weeks into the school year, this huge black kid was dumped in her lap. She, too, had seen the file on Big Mike that had come over from the Memphis city school system. After the transcript came Michael himself, accompanied by Mr. Simpson. He said, "This is Michael Oher, and you'll be working with him," recalled Graves. And Michael didn't say a thing. His head was always down. He kept his head down and his mouth shut. And she thought, oh Lord, what have we gotten ourselves into? She knew the coaches thought that he might help their sports teams, but even that surprised her. He was fat, she said. I didn't see how he could move it around. We weren't real sure what we were going to do with him, and I'll bet they weren't either. After Michael left her office, she went right back to Mr. Simpson to ask what good he imagined would come from letting this child into Briarcrest Christian School. He said, "Jennifer, let's give him till Christmas." She took him around and placed him in the middle of every classroom. By 6th period of the first day, everyone knew who he was. And he hadn't said a word. It was a matter of days before the reports poured in from the teachers. Every last one of them was asking the same question of her that she had asked Mr. Simpson. Why had they let this kid in? Big Mike had no conception of what school was about. He never had his books with him. He didn't speak in class. Nothing. He had no academic background, no foundation at all. His transcript said that he had taken algebra, but he obviously never laid eyes on it. Another shocking discovery. I don't know that he ever even read a Bible. At length, in response to an especially loud complaint from the English teacher, Graves brought Big Mike in her office. She pulled out a remedial English test and gave it to him. The first thing he was supposed to do, she recalled, was to identify parts of speech. He says, "What do I do?" And I say, "You mark all the parts of speech." He says, "I don't know them." So I say, "Let's start with nouns." He says, "I don't know them." I tell him a noun names a person, a place, or a thing. He said, "It does?" For him, English was almost like a second language. She noticed things about him. She noticed, for instance, he wore the same pair of cut-off jeans every day, and that he hadn't had the first idea how to interact with other people. Everyone in the school knew who he was, and he was the biggest human being anyone had ever seen. They tried to engage him, but he refused to comply. One day, while he was sitting with Michael, sorting out some mess or other, her own little girls, aged 6 and 9, came into her office, and they just stood there with their mouths open. They'd never seen anyone who looked like that. But then Big Mike left, and my 6-year-old asked, "Mom, who was that?" And I told her it was Big Mike. The next few days, the little girl went out of her way to find Big Mike in the school halls just to say, "Hi, Big Mike." And Big Mike just stared at her. The little girl came back to her mother, obviously frightened, and said, "Mama, he doesn't speak to me." Graves called Big Mike into her office and explained that if he wanted to stare at the ground mutely in her presence, that was fine. But when a little child tells you hello and you don't respond, you scare the little child. A few days later, Graves caught sight of Big Mike in the hallway, smiling and shaking hands with a crowd of small, awed children. Still, Michael Oher was only a few weeks into his tenure at Briarcrest before several teachers suggested he should be on his way out. He wasn't merely failing tests. He wasn't even starting them. The only honest grade to give him in his academic subjects was 0. And it wasn't just the academic subjects. Briarcrest offered a class in weightlifting, and Jennifer Graves had gotten him into it on the assumption it might offer him some relief from relentless failure. But there was one class Big Mike should have been able to ace. This was it. The weightlifting teacher, Coach Mark Bogus, said that Michael was neglecting to even change into gym clothes. He just sat around, not lifting even his eyes. The coach doubled as the Briarcrest track coach and already had made vague plans for Mike to put the shot for his team once he became academically eligible. The third time he watched Michael sit through class in street clothes, not even bothering to change into his sweats, he doubted that would ever happen. And he jumped on him. Michael, there are a lot of people in this school waiting to see you fail. Every little step that you make, people are watching. This is the one class in the whole school that can help you with your grades. All you have to do is show up, and right now, you're flunking weightlifting. The situation appeared hopeless and humiliating for all concerned. Word of the new boy's various failures inevitably reached Mr. Simpson, who also began to sense the dimensions of the void in the boy's life experiences. Michael Oher didn't know what an ocean was, or a bird's nest, or the tooth fairy. He couldn't very well be taught 10th grade biology if he had no clue what was meant by the word cell. And he couldn't very well get through 10th grade English if he never heard of a verb or a noun. It was as if he had materialized on the planet as an overgrown 16-year-old. Jennifer Graves had the same misgivings. The boy reminded her of a story she had read in Psychology Journal about a child who had been locked away inside of a closet for years. That child didn't even have tactile sense, but it felt like the same sort of thing. Big Mike was a blank slate. The obvious problem that he suffered from some learning disability had been ruled out. Graves called the Memphis school system and had been told that Michael Oher had been tested for learning disabilities and he had none. In short, they said, he was just stupid. By their standards, she said, he was achieving what was expected. It was then that the Briarcrest biology teacher, Marilyn Beasley, came to Graves in despair. She said that giving Michael yet another weekly biology test was pointless. Nothing came back. We've got to find out what he does and doesn't know, she said. She proposed that Graves replace her in the biology class and proctored the exam while she, Beasley, took Michael into a separate room and gave him the test verbally. The next day, Miss Beasley did take Michael into a room and sat down beside him, test in hand. By now, she, like the other teachers, knew about his academic record, and she had taught at Briarcrest for 21 years. Had entire classrooms of children with learning disabilities at that time, and had never experienced a student so seemingly hopeless. Quote, I had never encountered anybody at Michael's reading comprehension level, she said. His brain did not appear to contain any sort of intellect. As they sat down together, she noticed once again how enormous his hands seemed when she sat beside her. When set beside hers. She had a son who was 6'1", but compared to Big Mike, his hands were children's hands. She picked up the test and read aloud the first question from the multiple choice exam. Protozoans are classified based on A, how they get their food, B, how they reproduce, C, how they move, or D, both A and C. She waited for an answer and received nothing but a blank look. She knew the problem. Many of the words every 10th grader should know were foreign to him. Classified overwhelmed him. Science has its own vocabulary, she said. He didn't know it. He didn't know what a cell was or an atom. He didn't have the foundation to figure out meanings through prefixes and suffixes. He didn't know what the prefixes and suffixes were. They might as well have been Greek. The vast quantity of things he didn't know paralyzed his mind. A word at a time, she talked to him through the problem. Michael, do you remember what a protozoan is? Just down the hall, Jennifer Graves awaited for what she assumed would be bad news. She was already wondering about the best way to ease Big Mike out of the school. An hour later, Marilyn Beasley emerged with wonder on her face and a simple observation. He knows it. What? Jennifer, he knows the material. Or at any rate, he knew something. As he had given no sign of picking up anything, Beasley was shocked at how much he had absorbed. His brain wasn't dead. He simply had no idea how to learn in a classroom. Even so, he knew enough biology to get himself a C on the test and a high D for the semester instead of an F. He wasn't yet eligible to play any sports, but Graves could see that he longed to. He'd missed the football season, but it was basketball he was most eager to play. She hinted that if the biology test was any indication of the contents in his mind, he might well be eligible to play ball after Christmas and catch the last part of the season. The first thing he did was start hanging around the basketball court. When Shawn Tuohy first spotted Michael Oher sitting in the stands in the Briarcrest gym, staring at basketball practice, he saw a boy with nowhere to go but up. The question was how to take him there. Shawn was an American success story. He had come from nothing and made himself rich. He was 43 years old. His hairline had receded, but not quite to the point where you could call him bald, and his stomach had expanded, but not quite to the point where you could call him fat. He was keenly interested in social status, his own and other people's, but not in the old Southern kind. Not long after, he became a figure in Memphis, a rich businessman who had his own jet and was the radio voice of the Memphis Grizzlies. He had feelers from the Memphis Country Club. He didn't encourage them because, as he put it, I don't hang with the blues. I'd rather go to a high school football game on Friday night than go to a country club and drink 4 scotches and complain about my wife. Shawn Tuohy loved success. He delighted in the sight of people moving up in the world. Country clubs were all about staying in one place. When he introduced himself to Big Mike, Shawn was already knee-deep in various problems and crises of the few black students at Briarcrest. Shawn's daughter, Collins, a junior at Briarcrest and Tennessee champion in the pole vault, had guaranteed him almost constant exposure to them. She ran track. They ran track. The first time Shawn decided to play a role in their social education had been a couple years earlier when the track team traveled to Chattanooga for a meet. Coincidentally, also in Chattanooga, a Briarcrest tennis player was having a tournament at the fancy local country club. Shawn thought the black kids at Briarcrest might benefit from some exposure to tennis and golf and other white country club sports, and he thought the Briarcrest tennis player would enjoy a cheering section. Gathering up all 2 of the black kids on the track team, which amounted to 2/3 of the blacks at Briarcrest, he drove them to the Chattanooga Country Club. Sure enough, it was, for them, an entirely new experience. Neither had ever seen a tennis match in person, and while they had no idea how to keep score, they quickly worked out that the Briarcrest kid was amazing and making mincemeat of his opponent. After each point, they'd stand and holler and raise their fists, woo, 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 rather than explain tennis club etiquette, of which he vaguely disapproved anyway. Shawn let them have their fun. Between sets, they ran over to the concession stand where the little old lady sniffed at them. I just think y'all are in bad taste. To which one of the kids replied, you must be rooting for the other little white guy. The lady went off in a huff, and the kids returned to the match where the Briarcrest player kept on winning. The breaking point came when one of the kids stood up and screamed, keep on, you beating him like a $2 WHORE. Shawn tried to drag the boy by his oversized jersey back to his seat, but before he could get him down, the boy spotted the little old lady in the stands glaring at him and screamed, it's got to be killing you, ma'am. It's got to be killing you. Afterward, Shawn realized that it had been a while since he had so much fun. And by the time he met Big Mike, he had a new unofficial title, life guidance counselor to whatever black athletes stumbled into the Briarcrest Christian School. The black kids reminded him, in a funny way, of himself. Shawn knew what it meant to be the poor kid in a private school because he'd been one himself. First off, none of the rich kids realized that one big difference between public schools and private schools is that in the public schools, lunch was free. Every day for several years in high school, Shawn arrived without lunch or money to buy it, and bummed what he could from friends. When food is finite, he said, you'd be surprised how much time you spend thinking about it. He also knew what it was like to think of sports as a meal ticket. His sense that his future depended on his athletic ability was driven home during his freshman year in high school when his father, a legendary but ill-paid basketball coach, suffered a stroke and ceased to function. Shawn had adored his father. From the age of 3, when he grabbed a basketball and followed him to work in the morning, he had spent the better part of his life on his father's heels, soaking in everything that he could about basketball and life. 25 years later, he would say, "Everything I do is still all about my daddy." And yet, when he lost his father, he and everyone around him went on about their lives as if the earth had not just opened and swallowed up the most important person in his life. The fancy New Orleans private school was still, for him, free. Lunch was not. He left New Orleans for the University of Mississippi on a basketball scholarship. When he set out for Ole Miss, he was a 6'1", 147-pound exception. He wasn't even sure he could cut it as a college basketball player. When he walked off the court after his final game, he had set the NCAA record for career assists, and 25 years later, he still holds all meaningful SEC assist records. After he led Ole Miss to its first and still only SEC championship in 1981, a photograph of him, perched on top of the rim and bleeding from a cut on his chin as he cut down the nets, appeared in the New York Times. At a college still trying to figure out why their white boys were being whipped so routinely by the other team's black boys, he was an instant legend. That was the joy. The mystery was his essential powerlessness. He was at the mercy of a single man who specialized in tearing his players apart and leaving them in pieces. From the moment he arrived at the Ole Miss gym, Shawn realized that his coach had him trapped. He could only afford to stay in school so long as he played basketball, and he played at his coach's pleasure. His entire identity hung in the balance. From the age of 5, I had been trained to do one thing: play basketball. And if I couldn't do that, where did it leave me? And this coach, who had him by the short hairs, loved nothing more than to give them a yank, threatening to bench him, pull his scholarship, humiliate him in front of his hometown crowd when the Ole Miss team played in New Orleans. Early in his freshman year, for instance, the team traveled to Bloomington, Normal, Illinois, to play in a tournament. In the first game, they beat Loyola Chicago. In the finals, they got beat so badly by a nationally ranked Illinois State team. The game ended just before midnight, and they were supposed to drive the 4 hours to the St. Louis airport and then catch an early morning commercial flight back to Memphis. Shawn had played every minute of both games with a torn cartilage in his knee, and afterward had to be treated by trainers. When he emerged from the locker room, he found a fleet of cars and only one spot left in them, right beside his coach. No one else on the team wanted to sit next to the coach. For the next 4.5 hours, he said, not one word was spoken. Not one word. I got a cramp in my leg, and I remember holding back a scream because I was afraid of getting in trouble. They caught their plane, returned to Memphis, where a bus picked them up and carried them the rest of the way to Oxford, Mississippi. We drove onto campus. There isn't anyone there. It's Christmas Day. It's now 11 in the morning, and we still haven't slept. Coach gets up in front of the bus and says, "Dressed, stretched, and taped. 30 minutes. And I just remember going, I don't know about y'all, but I haven't slept. Still, the players all trudged to the locker room, donned practice uniforms, and set out for the film room. That's how practice always started, by watching films of their most recent performance and being humiliated by the coach. The players found their seats, the lights went down, and coach entered the room. He always took a wide circle on his way to his lounge chair in the back. The players felt watched. I had played 40 minutes of both games, Shawn said. My knee was swelled up as big as Dallas. We hadn't slept. It's my first Christmas away from home. Coach walked around, so he was right behind me and stopped. Never once in 4 years did he call me Shawn. It was either Buddy or 12. Now he comes right up behind me and says, "Hey, 12, Merry fucking Christmas." The lights went out, and I cried for the next 40 minutes. The assistant coach literally sat there rubbing my back and patting me. For 4 years, he'd played what he called survival ball. He had to play, or he couldn't afford school. The New Jersey Nets drafted him in a late round to play in the NBA, but the desire had gone out of him. He left Ole Miss with a fiancée and a new religion, but he left without a penny. Now, by the fall of 2002, he'd become, by just about every way they measured it in Memphis, a success. He'd been born again. He helped to create one of the fastest growing evangelical churches in Memphis, the Grace Evangelical Church. He married the Ole Miss cheerleader who 25 years later could still pass for an Ole Miss cheerleader. And he owned a chain of 85 Taco Bells, KFCs, and Long John Silver restaurants, along with a mountain of debt. His financial life remained risky. If everything broke right, he might soon be worth as much as $50 million. If everything did not break right, he could always call games for the Memphis Grizzlies. What Atlanta was to the American South, Shawn Tuohy was to the white Southern male. Prosperous, forever upgrading the trappings of his existence, happy to exchange his past at a deep discount for a piece of the future. It wasn't enough. The restaurants ran themselves. The Grizzlies gig was a night job. Church was on Sundays. He needed to avert drama in his life. He was a person for whom the clock was always running out. The game was always tied, and the ball was always in his hands. He'd played the role for so long that he became that role. And now he had all the time in the world for what he still loved more than anything: hanging around school gyms and acting as a kind of consultant to the coaches at Briarcrest in their dealings with their players. Shawn was interested in poor jocks in the same way that a former diva might be interested in opera singers or a Jesuit scholar in debaters. What he liked about them was that he knew how to help them. What I learned playing basketball at Ole Miss, he said, was what not to do. Beat up a kid. It's easy to beat up a kid. The hard thing is to build him up. Collins had mentioned Big Mike to her father. When she tried to pass him on the stairwell, she said she had to go back to the top because she couldn't fit past him. Without uttering a peep, the kid had become the talk of the school. Everyone was frightened of him, she said, until they realized that he was far more terrified of them. Shawn had seen Big Mike around the halls 3 or 4 times. He noticed that he wore the same clothes every day: cut-off blue jeans, oversized t-shirt. Now he saw him in the stands and thought, I bet he's hungry. Shawn walked over and said, You don't know me, but we have more in common than you might think. Michael stared intently at his feet. What'd you have for lunch today? Shawn asked. In the cafeteria, said the kid. I didn't ask where you ate, said Shawn. I asked what you ate. Had a few things, said Michael. Sure you did, thought Shawn. He asked if he needed money for lunch, and Mike said, I don't need any money. The next day, Shawn went to Briarcrest accounting department and arranged for Michael Oher to have a standing charge card at the lunch checkout counter. He'd done the same for several of the poorer black kids who had come to Briarcrest. In a couple of the cases, he had in effect paid their tuition by giving money to a school fund earmarked for scholarships for those who couldn't afford the tuition. That was my only connection with Michael, he said. Lunch. Shawn left it at lunch, and at lunch might have been how it ended. But a few weeks later, the Briarcrest Christian School took its Thanksgiving break. One cold and blustery morning, Shawn and his wife Leanne were driving down one of the main boulevards of East Memphis when, off a bus just ahead of them, steps this huge black kid. He was dressed in the same pair of cut-off jeans and t-shirt he always wore. Shawn pointed out to his wife and said, that kid I was telling you about, that's him, Big Mike. But he's wearing shorts, she said. Uh-huh. He always wears those. Shawn, it's snowing. And so it was. At Leanne's insistence, they pulled over. Shawn reintroduced himself to Michael and then introduced Michael to Leanne. Where are you going? He asked Mike. To basketball practice, said Big Mike. Michael, you don't have basketball practice, says Shawn. I know, said the boy, but they got heat there. Shawn didn't understand that one. It's nice and warm in that gym, said the boy. As they drove off, Shawn looked over and saw tears streaming down Leanne's face, and he thought, uh-oh, my wife's about to take over. The next day, afternoon, Leanne left her business. She had her own interior decorating outfit, turned up at Briarcrest, picked up the kid, and took off with him. A few hours later, Shawn's cell phone rang. He picked up and heard his wife's voice on the other end of the line. "Do you know how big a 58 long jacket is?" she asked. "How big?" "Not big enough." Leanne Tuohy had grown up with a firm set of beliefs about black people, but she had shed them for another, and couldn't tell you exactly how it happened, other than to say that, "I married a man who doesn't know his own color." Her father, a United States Marshal based in Memphis, raised her to fear and loathe black people as much as he did. Friends who saw Tommy Lee Jones in the movie U.S. Marshal would say to her, "Oh my God, that is your father." The moment the courts ordered the Memphis public school system integrated in 1973, Leanne's father pulled her out of public school and put her into the newly founded Briarcrest Christian School, where she'd become a member of the first graduating class. "I was raised in a very racist household," Leanne said. As her father walked her up the aisle so that she might wed Shawn, he looked around the church, filled with Shawn's black ex-teammates, and asked, "Why are all these N-words here?" But actually spells it out in this book. Even as an adult, when she mentioned in passing that she was on her way into a black neighborhood on the west side of Memphis for some piece of business, the father would insist on escorting her. Quote, "And when he comes to get me, he shows up with his magnum strapped to his chest," Leanne would later say. Yet, by the time Michael Oher arrived at Briarcrest, Leanne Tuohy didn't see anything odd or even awkward in taking him in hand. This boy was new. He had no clothes. He had no warm place to stay over Thanksgiving break. For Lord's sake, he was walking to school in the snow in shorts when school was out of session on the off chance he could get into the gym and keep warm. Of course, she took him out and bought him some clothes. It struck others as perhaps a bit aggressively philanthropic. For Leanne, clothing a child is just what you did if you had the resources. She had done this sort of thing before, and she would do it again. "God gives people money to see how you're going to handle it," she said, and she intended to prove she knew how to handle it. For Leanne, the mystery began once Michael climbed into her gray minivan. He got in the car and didn't say anything, not one word. "Tell me everything I need to know about you," she said. She noticed his sneakers all beat up and raggedy. "Who takes care of you?" He didn't answer. "I've noticed in the African American community the grandmother often helps to raise the kids. Do you have a grandmother?" He didn't, but he didn't explain. This wouldn't do. Leanne Tuohy was an extreme and seemingly combustible mixture of tenderness and willfulness. She cried when a goldfish died. On her daily walks, when she spotted an earthworm sizzling on the sidewalk, she picked it up and put it back on the grass. On the other hand, when a large drunk man pushed and cut his way in front of her in a line outside of a football game, she grabbed him by the arm and screamed, "You just get your fat ass right back to where it belongs now." When she did things like this, her husband would shrug and say, "You have to understand that my wife has a heart the size of a pea. If you cross her, she will step on your throat and take you out, and she won't feel a thing." Shawn had decided no matter what the potential gains, it was never worth provoking his wife. And this child's reluctance to answer her questions had provoked her. "We're going to keep talking about this," she said. "We can do it the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. Take your pick." That worked, sort of. She learned that he'd not laid eyes on his father in many years. He never had much to do with his grandmother, who was now gone. He had a sister, but didn't know where she was. His mother was, Leanne surmised, an alcoholic. But he never actually used the word alcoholic, Leanne said. He let me say it and never corrected me. I didn't know then, but Michael will let you believe what you want to believe. After torturing him for a bit, she decided to leave him be. She had had too much success getting what she wanted to pay much attention to temporary setbacks. It was only a matter of time before he'd tell her everything. "I knew that 103.5 FM was kind of a black station, so I had that playing," she said. "I didn't want him thinking this was some charity thing and, oh, poor pitiful me." So I said that the Briarcrest basketball team needed its players looking spiffy, and we were just going to go make sure that happened. If it were up to her, she would have driven him straight to Brooks Brothers or Ralph Lauren, but she realized that might make him feel uncomfortable. No offense, but where do you go buy clothes? She asked. He mentioned a place. It was in a less affluent section of Memphis, not the safest neighborhood. She set off in that direction, heading west. You okay going there? He asked. I'm okay going there with you. You're going to take care of me, right? Right, he said. She sensed a little shift in him. Sooner or later, she'd break him. I can talk to a wall, she liked to say. For the next couple of hours, that's just what she did. She was facing a new problem, trying to guess from his body language what a 16-year-old black child of the ghetto might wear to his new white Christian school. They arrived at the first of many big and tall shops and ran smack into another problem. Nothing fit him. He wasn't big or tall. He was big and tall. The selection of clothing into which he could painlessly squeeze himself was limited, and he reduced it by refusing to wear anything that wasn't loose-fitting. For 20 minutes or so, she pulled the biggest articles of clothing so that she could find off the shelves and racks, without a comment from the boy. Michael, she said finally, you gotta tell me if you like it or not. I cannot read your mind, or we're gonna be here till Christmas with me trying to guess what you like. She pulled down the absolute biggest shirt that she could find. I think that's okay, Michael said, at length. For him, it counted as a soliloquy. No, not okay. You need to love it. If you don't love it in the store, you're never going to wear it once you get back home. The store is where you like it best. Well, she ain't wrong about that. She pulled down a gargantuan brown and yellow rugby shirt. I like that one, he said. She was 5'1", 115 pounds, blonde hair, straight white teeth, and the most perfect pink dress. He was black, poor, 3 times her size. Everyone stared at them. And as they moved from shop to shop, the surroundings, the attention, became more discomforting. At the final big and tall shop, on the border of what had just been pronounced by the 2000 United States Census the third poorest zip code in the country, Leanne said, I've lived here my whole life, and I've never been to this neighborhood. And then Big Mike finally spoke up. Don't worry, he said. I got your back. Along the way, she asked him more questions. But of course, they were the wrong questions, she said later. She noticed little things about him, however, and these were tiny clues. I can tell he wasn't used to being touched. The first time I try to touch him, he just freezes up. When they were finished shopping, he was heaped with packages, and yet he insisted he wanted to take the bus home. I'm not letting him ride the bus with all these bags. She drove him back into what she assumed must be the worst neighborhood of Memphis. They stopped in at McDonald's. He ordered for himself 2 quarter-pounders with cheese. On a hunch, she bought 6 extra burgers for him to take home with him. At length, they reached what he said was his mother's house. It was an ominous, dark, red brick building behind a tall metal gate. Across the street was an abandoned house. The scrub grass, the dead plants in pots, the flaking paint on the houses, everything, including the small children in the streets, looked uncared for. She parked and stepped out of the car to help him with all the bags, and that's when he sprang into action. Don't get out, he said. I'll just help you with the bags. You don't need to get out of the car, he said. He was so insistent that she stepped back inside the car and promised to stay put with the doors locked, while he went in and found someone to help him with his packages. A few minutes later, a line of small children streamed out of the front gates of the depressing apartment building and, ant-like, lifted the sacks and carried them inside. When the last child had moved the last package, the gate closed behind him. He hadn't given her the first clue of what he thought of her, or of their strange afternoon together. Probably, she figured, that I'm some nice lady who wanted something from him. So when he thanked her, she made a point of saying, Michael, it was my pleasure. You don't owe me anything. And that, she thought, was that. It wasn't, of course. He was different from the other children that she and Shawn had helped out. For a start, he was obviously more destitute, and she couldn't explain why. Just then, she was drawn to him and felt the urge to do things for him. He was just this big old kid who could have been mean and scary and thuggy. But everything about him was soft and gentle and sweet-natured. With him, she felt completely safe, even if he wasn't saying anything. She sensed he was watching out for her. She went home and thought about the problems still at hand, how to clothe the biggest 16-year-old boy she'd ever laid eyes on. She flipped through her Rolodex. Several of her interior decorating clients were professional athletes. All but one were basketball players, and all of them were tall and thin. The other was Patrick Ramsey, the Washington Redskins' new starting quarterback. I know how these athletes are about their clothes, she said. They're very particular, and they're tossing them out and getting new ones all the time. What more fertile source of extra-large hand-me-downs than the NFL? She called Ramsey, who had said he was more than happy to dun his teammates for old clothing. She gave him Michael's measurements, and Patrick Ramsey took them down. A few days later, he called back. "You got these measurements wrong," he said matter-of-factly. She explained that she had taken the measurements herself and written them down on a piece of paper. It must be Patrick who got them wrong. He read them back to her: 20-inch neck, 40-inch sleeve, 50-inch waist, 58-inch chest, etc. Nope, he had them right. "There's no one on our team as big as he is," Ramsey said. She thought he was kidding. "Leanne," said the Redskins quarterback, "we only have one player on this team who is even close, and he wears Wrangler blue jeans and flannel shirts, and I don't think a black kid is going to be caught dead wearing that stuff. That would be John Jansen, the Redskins' starting right tackle." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "Who is this kid?"